is a message statement for the book of Exodus, and I'll be getting you a study guide here to start working on the second exam, and it will have message statements. I'll also be giving you a little a sheet of message statements with the book on the front and the message statement on the back, so you can cut it up into little flashcards. And by the end of the semester, we'll have, well, I don't know, not half the books, but a bunch of the books. So this will be kind of cumulative. So this is what Israel is all about. Having become a numerous people. And how did that happen? Well, not biologically. Well, you're going to be rough on me this morning. Not biologically. Why were they able to become a numerous people? Let me put it that way. What? Yeah. Okay, because God had moved the family down to Egypt from Canaan, and in the outworking of His promise to Abraham that they would become a numerous people, He saw to it that they were in a place where they could do that. So, over this 400-year period or so, they have become a numerous people, and out of that numerous people, God creates a nation. He brings forth a fledgling nation. You know what the word fledgling means? An infant nation. And there really is a birth imagery here. And so it's not out of line with respect to the text of Scripture to think of the land of Goshen being a womb in which the nation was growing. And finally, when He brings them out of Egypt, He is going to constitute them as a nation. And so He brings forth a fledgling nation created by His sovereign grace and cared for out of His steadfast love. That is my statement that puts together the book of Exodus. So it's not just a migration of people from one place to another. It really can be thought of as a birth, the birth of a nation. It's not explicitly stated that way, but there are many images which would lend itself to that kind of an analogy. Now, just some introduction. You've read the introductory comments in Encountering the Old Testament. And remember, in a book like this that has to be published for a broad range of readership, and it's a conservative work. It's done by people who take the Bible seriously, but there are various views, and so they present all the views. And it will cover some of the contrasting views, some of which have more biblical evidence to them than others. But you've read that, but let me just summarize for ourselves just some basic things about Exodus. First of all, as to historicity, I take it as factual. These are events that really happened. These people really did come out of Egypt. This isn't just a story that later Israel made up to come up with some kind of a mythology about their origins so that they could make for themselves some kind of an image of who they were. This is really what happened. And the more evidence we find, the more archaeological things that are dug up and discovered all underscore that and support that. And there's an interesting book that was published just a couple of years ago, The Historicity of the Old Testament by Kenneth Kitchen. He's an Egyptologist. And he just goes through the whole realm of all the evidence that we have that really support the facticity of the biblical record. And while we don't have this exact story anywhere in ancient texts, yet the conditions and just the locations and all kinds of things just really underscore that this is a book that can be taken historically, to be historically true, though it is not being written as a history. The date, I take the early date for the Exodus, 1446, 45 BC, rather than the 1290 or 1260 date that is later, although interestingly, Kenneth Kitchen takes the later date. But that is debated among conservative scholars. 1 Kings 6:1 indicates that the Exodus occurred 480 years before Solomon. That argues for the early date. And you have to do something else with that number. You have to take it in some kind of a symbolic sense to argue a later date. The numbers are used loosely and symbolically in some places in Scripture, but I don't think this one is. The city of Ramses is debated as to how it interacts with the date of the Exodus. It mentions the city of Ramses, and Ramses was a pharaoh at the later period. But that doesn't mean that the name didn't exist before and the city couldn't have been called that before, or that they're calling the city by its later name, an anachronism. And so this does not necessarily argue against the early date. Probably one of the most important things is the Pharaoh's length of reigns. There has to be a Pharaoh who reigned for 40 years in order to account for the evidence in Exodus. That Moses went, he fled, into Midian, and then he came back 40 years later after the death of that Pharaoh. Well, Ramses didn't reign 40 years. And the Pharaoh before Ramses didn't reign 40 years. It's really only the conditions that were in the earlier date, 1446, that satisfy that. And I think that's pretty important evidence. And Eugene Merrill covers that in some of his works, Kingdom of Priests and other of his historical works. There's archaeology. As I said, the various things that we discover from Egypt do fit in with the early date. The route of the Exodus, that's a very interesting question. It is debated and so forth. Here's a map which has on it the generally accepted route of the Exodus. There are I've got a tricky thumb here. I'm getting there. It's the other button I want. I got to get my pointer here. Okay. Some of the proposed routes that do not take historically, the book historically, there's one route that proposes that it kind of went up here on this thing and came down here into kind of a land bridge in shallow water. There are some other routes that are proposed that really don't take the serious evidence of Exodus seriously. But those who do take a literal Red Sea crossing, there is a proposal that they came down this way and crossed here across some area here in the Red Sea, and then up to Mount Sinai. There is this most probably accepted traditional route that comes down across the eastern edge of this what we would call the Suez Lake now, that area, the top part of the Red Sea, and then to the traditional Mount Sinai. There's another one that would start somewhere here, would come this direction down into Hazeroth. It does mention, and there's a place name, and then a crossing here, and the Mount Sinai being somewhere here in Midian. And these are just some of the routes that are argued by different scholars, conservative scholars, but we're not going to argue them today. And actually, I think that there is credible evidence for this route on a number of counts. But the evidence just has never been able to be looked at and dealt with. It's very difficult to be in here. Now, one of the things that is appealing to this route is, from your reading of Exodus, where was Moses when God appeared to him at the burning bush? What was he doing? Okay, while he was living in Midian, okay, and God says, "I will bring you back to this mountain." Now, if that were the case, it would mean that Moses was tending sheep down here somewhere. That seems strange. If you've ever been there, it seems real strange. Nothing there. Nothing ever been there as far as we can tell. And somebody built a monastery there once and called it Mount Sinai, and that's become the traditional site. And so there are a number of arguments that are appealing with regard to Sinai being over here somewhere, but we don't have to know in order to take the Bible as factual. It happened across water that was deep enough to bury the Egyptian army and kill them. And so the Exodus did take place, and all of the historical, archaeological, geographical data that we do have supports the facticity of it, even though we may not be able to satisfy ourselves with the exact route. If we needed to have the exact route, God would have made sure we had it. We don't. Where's what? Well, it would have been somewhere in here, and this is all changed topographically. And this is one of the problems, is that, is there ever been a body of water in here large enough for the effects of, and would they had their backs against the sea and so forth. So, yeah, there are all kinds of questions you have to answer. But I'm not going to get bogged down in debate on this here because we don't have time.
I was just going to ask, why have there ever been any hieroglyphs found or anything among Egyptian ruins? Because it seems like it would be a pretty important story to them that all this is.
Well, but you usually don't tell the stories that are negative to you. And this is true of the ancient world. So when the Assyrians fight the Egyptians, if the Egyptians win, you find a lot about it in Egyptian writings. You don't find much about it in Assyrian writings, and the other way. So that doesn't really help us. Just the absence of something doesn't mean, it didn't happen. The presence obviously would. So anyway, just to realize, there are a number of different proposals with regard to the roots of the Exodus, and we can study them, but it doesn't necessarily become that helpful. Mount Sinai, again, where it is depends upon the Exodus. We don't have a mountain that we can go to, that we can get into, that we can confirm they were there, that had, a cave writing, Moses slept here. We don't have anything like that. We don't have anything like that. So again, it's supposition from the evidence that we have. But there is nothing that has ever been produced in the artifactual or written works or topography, geography, that mitigates against this happening, that says this could never have happened, this kind of an event. And so it's written as history. We can take it as history. It is the events by which God redeems His Son. That's what it says in Exodus 4:22. Say to Pharaoh, Israel is my son, my firstborn. Let my son go that he may serve me. So God, as a kinsman, is rescuing His Son from slavery to a foreign power and delivering him into a new service in a new place. And so really it is the birth of the Son Nation out of Egypt that we have. And that's the way I want to handle this, of thinking about how this is the creation of a nation. We talk about the United States and the War of Independence, and we talk about the birth of a nation, the events that led up to the birth of the nation, the War of Independence, and then the framing of the Constitution and the colonies signing the Constitution, and that was the birth of the nation, the United States. And so we really are thinking about the coming into being of a nation out of these people. And so we have various analogies like this, and that's why I've entitled this, or The Birth of the Son Nation out of Egypt, the first 15 chapters of Exodus. We see, first of all, God's people in bondage in 1:1-22. God's people in bondage. The text, and I've put together here the last few verses of Genesis 50 with the first verses of Exodus 1. Now, how many years is there in between Genesis and Exodus? Well, Abraham has said that they'll sojourn 400 years, but then you've got, his sons and so forth. But there's, several hundred years. Joseph said to his brethren, I am dying, but God will surely visit you, bring you out of this land to the land of which He swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry my bones up from here. So Joseph expected to be there long enough that all that was left of him were bones. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him and put him in a coffin in Egypt. So he had clearly in mind the promises made to Abraham, the Abrahamic covenant, that Israel was not going to stay in Egypt, that Israel was not going to be lost and just assimilated into the Egyptian population. And we find then Exodus 1 really picking up that flow. Now these are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt. Each man and his household came with Jacob. And it lists the sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, and so forth. All those who were descendants of Jacob were 70 persons, for Joseph was in Egypt already. And then Exodus 1:8, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And it happen in the event of war that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. So Pharaoh, verse 22, so Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you shall cast the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. And so we see the people in bondage, the people that have a direct relation to Abraham and to these promises and to the events that had transpired hundreds of years earlier. But then Yahweh acts, the Lord acts in this situation, and we see the provision of the deliverer, Moses. He provides and prepares for Moses. That's what we have in the early story. We find Moses being born and cared for in chapter 2, verses 1 to 10. It says, and the man of the house of Levi took as a wife a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. Verse 10, the child grew. She brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. Very interesting turn of events. How this baby that is supposed to have been put to death is adopted into Pharaoh's house and is raised as a son of Pharaoh, and therefore is educated and learns all of the things of Egypt, and God uses that later on. God is just orchestrating this whole thing, and we see him doing that throughout history. So she called his name Moses, saying, because I drew him out of the water. There's a play on words here, but we won't get into that kind of detail. So Moses is born and cared for. We see very clearly the providential arrival of Moses and the protection of Moses and putting him in a place where God could use him. And we see him being provided and protected. Chapter 2, verses 11 to 25. Came to pass in those days, Exodus 2:11, when Moses was grown, that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. Now realize that again, it's important to understand that they were segregated in the land of Goshen because they were herdsmen. And the Egyptians didn't like herdsmen. They were a subclass of people, and so they wouldn't let them live among them. They said, you go live down there. You go to the other side of the tracks. Don't come over and, involve yourselves with us. And so even though Joseph had this very high position in Pharaoh's court, yet God took them down there because he knew they would be able to stay together as one people. They wouldn't just be assimilated into the population. That's what would normally happen in a case like this, where 75 people were transported into another culture. Is that they would intermarry, they might retain a memory of their roots and their ethnicity, but they would become Egyptians. They didn't. And so we find this people with their own history, their own sense of identity, still, this 400 years later, and Moses is aware of that. He's sensitive to that, even though he's been raised in Pharaoh's house. So he looked this way, that. When he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian. He hid him in the sand. When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses. Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh. He dwelt in the land of Midian. We noticed where that was on the map a moment ago. Then Moses was content to live with the man, and he gave Zipporah his daughter to Moses. She bore him a son, called his name Gershom, For he said, I've been a stranger in a foreign land. And so we see Moses protected, provided for. We see Moses called and commissioned. And this is important. Now Moses was tending flock of Jethro, Exodus 3. His father-in-law, the priest of Midian, he led the flock to the back of the desert, came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses, and he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Whenever you see that phrase, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, you have to read into it the Abrahamic covenant. You have to read into it. These are the patriarchs. These are the men, the first to whom God made the covenant, the next two to whom He confirmed the covenant, and they are the beginning of God's dealing with you as a people. And so this stock phrase, the patriarchs of Israel, is important in these contexts. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. So he's in the he knows the God, but he doesn't know Him as he will. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. For I know their sorrows. God had taken them there. God had protected them. God was now ready to deliver them from their affliction. The affliction had a purpose. The difficulty had a purpose. It wasn't easy. They went through some terrible things. They lost newborn children because of the oppression of the Egyptians. They were slaves. They were being taken advantage of. God knew all that. God had directed it. But it was for the ultimate purposes that He had, and He was still there for them individually and now as a nation. So I've come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from the land to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, and the Hivites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and all the Zites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And so we see here God being called and commissioned, and then Moses petitioning for his petitions for Yahweh's firstborn, his prayers, what he is asking for in verses 18 to 31. Exodus 3:13, then Moses said to God, Indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say, What is His name? Names are important in the ancient world, and the name of the God is important in the ancient world, and the names meant something. What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And He said, Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And so he really deals with a form of the verb to be, and God's name by which He is revealed is a form of this verb to be. And that's why He can say, I am has sent you. Moreover, God said to Moses, Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, The Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial to all generations. We'll come back to the name in a moment. So then in Exodus 3:16, He says, Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, The Lord God. Notice we've got two words for God there, and they're the ones that we ran into in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. The Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, appeared to me, saying, I have surely visited you, seen what is done to you in Egypt. And I have said, I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites. and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, to a land flowing with milk and honey. So God reveals himself to Moses in his name, and that is the basis, that he is to convince, to marshal the nation to follow, to leave the known for the unknown. And you know, it's difficult. You might think, well, why wouldn't they go? Look at what they were experiencing. Well, psychologically, human beings are more afraid of the unknown, whatever it is, than the present known, even though it may be negative. And you see that worked out in so many aspects of life and relationship. And so while there is a sense of a difference of who they were from the Egyptians, would also be the natural hesitancy to leave. And what God gives Moses as the ultimate basis for why they should is his name, who he is. And that would evoke all that we find written in the book of Genesis. Now, how much they would have had the basics of Genesis. He keeps referring to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They knew who that was. They knew what this God had done. They would have had this information. And Moses was there to give them this background information. But the name is what becomes very clear. Now, I'm going to deal a little bit with the name today. With regard to just this whole thing of the personal name of Jehovah, or personal name that's often translated Jehovah. Because it's the way it's been handled in translation and in present texts is sometimes confusing. I'm going to give you a little Hebrew lesson this morning in regard to what this is. The name is probably should be translated Yahweh. Whenever you find God in the Bible, unless it's all capital God, and that's a different case, it's Elohim. And that is the name for God, or El, a shortened form of God. There's another word in the Bible, Adonai, which means Lord or Master. That can be used of people. Joseph would refer to Pharaoh as Adonai. But sometimes it also referred to God. And we've got an interplay of these three names. The personal name for God, the Hebrew text as it originally was utilized clear down past the time of Christ had no vowels, just a consonantal text. So for instance, if I wrote on the board RLTNSHP, what word is that? RLTNSHP. Relationship. Now, how'd you know that? I didn't give you any vowels. You just knew. Well, they just knew how to fill in the vowel sounds in this consonantal language. And so, at this time, even at the time of Christ, Hebrew was a consonant language. That's all they had, was the consonants. They didn't have vowels. It was the Masoretes, like 1,000 years after Christ, who said, this language is going to be lost. People are going to forget how to say it if we don't give some clues as to what the vowels are. And so the whole vowel pointing system occurred very late in history, relatively speaking. And so what we have in these little dots and things above and below letters are the vowels that go with the consonants. And so the top word, or the tetragrammaton, probably would have been pronounced Yahweh. It's a verb to be, and so we think about how it would have formed, and there is an absolute agreement on this, but generally speaking, this is what it was thought, Yahweh. Adonai is the bottom word, and what happened was, you remember, let me go back, what happened was that in the law, it said not to take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Over the course of time, of course, the Jewish people became, very superstitious in some regards, and very fussy about, how not to violate the law. And they came to the point, they did, taking the name in vain, they came to understand as even mispronouncing the name. And that became such an issue with them that they came to the point in their history where they would not pronounce the name when they came to it, lest they mispronounced it and therefore blaspheme the name of God. And so what they said is, whenever we come to this word, which probably should have been pronounced Yahweh, though they didn't give us vowel pointings for it, they said, let's say Adonai. We'll just repeat it. We know in our minds what word is there. We know the context. We've memorized the whole Old Testament. They did that sort of thing. So we'll say Adonai so that we don't violate this prohibition against taking the name in vain. So what they did is, well, how do we do this in the written text? Well, let's put in the vowels for Adonai with the consonants for Yahweh. So they took this vowel for Adonai and they moved it up there and replaced that vowel. They've got 3 vowels for Adonai, so they have to add a vowel. So they take this up and they put that up there. That's an O sound, all right? And this one was the same, but it's a little bit different. So now you've got the consonants for one name and the vowels for the other. Now, when the Jews were reading this, they knew exactly what was going on. They knew that it was a combination of 2 names. They were to read the word that the vowels were there for, Adonai. If you mispronounce Adonai, no big deal. It just means master. But if you mispronounce Yahweh, that's a big deal. So they were happy with that, but the problem came in later English translation, when people who were translating the text did not realize what was going on. For the Jews, when one saw this, they did not say Yahweh, they said Adonai. All right? They just said one word for the other. The vowels just gave the clue as to what to say. But someone saw this, and instead of saying Adonai, realizing what was going on, they made a new word out of it. And that's how you get Jehovah. All right? There are only 2 vowels in Yahweh. There are 3 in Jehovah, aren't there? And that's how that came about. It was a misunderstanding of this thing of combining the vowels for one word used for God and the consonants for another. And so we see this and say Yahweh. If you're going to pronounce the name, say Yahweh. Or what the English translations did, because they couldn't agree on it, and when conservative translations were coming out, they said, oh, if we put in Yahweh, they're going to think we're liberal and we've gone crazy. So we'll come up with this convention. We'll put Lord in all capital letters. So when you see Lord in all capital letters, though the next to the ORD are a little shorter, that's what they're looking at, Yahweh. They're not perpetuating the air of Jehovah, but they haven't gone all the way to Yahweh. Adonai would be Lord in upper and lowercase. So when you're reading your English Bibles, and you see Lord, look and see whether it's all caps or whether it's capital L, lowercase O-R-D. And you will know thereby that you are dealing with either Yahweh or Adonai. Huh? Lord? They are in English. Well, except that Adonai can be used of a human being. So in some contexts, it's not referring to God. But when it's referring to God, it's referring to the same thing. But by using the name, it will refer to different aspects of Him and can have interpretive ramifications with respect to what's being emphasized about God and His role. So that's what we have in that name.